Welcome to another edition of the Flex How-To webinars. Today we're going to be going over expense sheets in Flex. So the way Flex was designed was to be able to help facilitate information flow between all people using it. A job is typically isolated in and of itself. Typically there are people that are out running the gear, there are expenses that are associated with that, and so this webinar is going to show expense sheets and how you can use those to put in other general ledger expenses that apply towards jobs that aren't PO related. So as an example, in this job we've got a Yamaha PM5D on the quote, we've got an audio engineer, and we're charging per diem. Now if we had a rental PO to subrent this PM5D, if we didn't have enough, that would be a purchase order that we would typically put into the system that would resolve a conflict, and that PO price or cost would be associated in the job cost field. Well, what happens if you get on site and there's some additional expenses that really you aren't going to get a PO to get Wi-Fi on site if you need to get onto the web, or if you go and buy crew lunch and things like that, you aren't going to send a PO over to McDonald's, things like that. And so that's exactly the area where expense sheets come in handy. As configured in the system, you can add expense sheets as child elements to quotes. Let's take a look at their configuration and some of the things that they affect. If you go to Projects, Project Elements, and we'll go to Expense Sheets, you have your typical fields here for identity, field settings, numbering, status options. By default there are no workflow status options, but in theory you could create workflows for expense sheet created and expense show accounted for, things like that, whatever comes in mind, but right now there are no status options and there are no workflows. Under allowable, under expense sheet options, there's an allowable resource types. If everything was set to no, all of these resources would show up in the drop down per line item. If you turn very specific one on, then it only shows those three in the drop down. You can also configure a default resource type. So we have put show expense as a default resource type. Some people would want to include a PO number as a field per expense or an invoice number. Right now we have turned those fields off. If we go back to our quote and add an expense sheet, we can give it a name. Some people will have a single expense sheet for a quote. Others might have an expense sheet per person. So as an example, if there were two people who were on this job and both of them had expenses per on their card or out of pocket, you may want to have a expense sheet per person. So one quote might have two expense sheet child items with the name test job cost / expense sheet, maybe / Chris Stein, something like that. When we hit accept, you'll see in the project tree this quote now has an expense sheet as a child element, similar to everything else that we use in the system. You have a description field. You have a type. Notice that we have the 3 selected allowable resource types in our drop-down. Vendor, you can either search for a vendor or just hand type a name. You don't have to put in a vendor called McDonald's or Pizza Hut, something like that. If you had the PO capture or invoice number captured, those would appear before the expense field. Right now we have those turned off, and then you hit the add button. So we could put in crew lunch and put it in as a show expense. and hit add. So it simply adds a general ledger for those items, updates the total, and there is the very most simplest expense sheet that you could have. Other examples might be on-site Wi-Fi purchase. As an example, and maybe they charge us $15 to get Wi-Fi. Maybe you had a parking that you had to pay for. As you'll notice, all of these are things that typically you wouldn't create a PO for and add as a PO as a child element, and that's why this expense sheet is so powerful. It's just a simple way to add all the ancillary stuff. And maybe we showed up and we didn't have power strips and we needed to go buy power strips to make the show happen. So these are all different expenses that will affect our bottom line when it comes to how profitable was the whole job. Other things that we have added into the functionality is we've enabled to add documents to this. So if I hit add document, I now have a place where I could scan my receipts and upload them as a child element to my expense sheet. So I'm going to go in here and there's my power strip receipt and I can upload it. So now I have information where my accounting person can go in and review all the receipts that I've uploaded that is a child element to that expense sheet. So let's go back to the overall cost of the job and we'll reload this page and let's review our job costing functionality. So we have all the different areas where we've received different revenue from rental resources, labor resources, travel costs, etc. Now you'll notice there are some other expenses down here, and for expense sheets we've got this amount of expenses that are expenses in the system. And we can look at all the different expenses in there. So the main thing we want to do is facilitate communication within the company. If you have troubles with your account managers getting all the costs into the system so that your bookkeeper can look at all the costs that are really associated with this, this might be a great tool for your company to use, and what we really hope is that it facilitates communication between the different areas in Flex. If you have any other questions, please contact support@flexrentalsolutions.com.